In 1913, John D. Rockefeller was worth approximately $900 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's somewhere between $25 billion and $30 billion in today's money. He died in 1937. That was 88 years ago. And yet, the Rockefeller family is still one of the most powerful dynasties in America. Still sitting on boards, still shaping policy, still present in banking, philanthropy, and politics, still wealthy. How? Not because they got lucky, not because each generation happened to produce a genius, and definitely not because they simply saved money in a bank account. The answer is something far more deliberate, far more sophisticated, and far more hidden than most people ever realize. Old money families, the dynasties that have held power across generations in America, Europe, Asia, and beyond, have developed a remarkably consistent, remarkably effective set of strategies for doing one thing above everything else: keeping the power in the family. Not just the money, the power, the influence, the access, the ability to shape the world around them rather than simply react to it. And they do it quietly, without press releases, without Instagram posts, without anyone outside the circle fully understanding the machinery at work. Today, we are going to walk through every mechanism, every structure, every strategy. We're going to name names, cite research, follow the money, and by the end of this video, you will never look at inherited wealth or at the institutions that surround it the same way again. Stay with me. This one goes deep. The dynasty mindset, thinking in centuries, not years. Before we get into the specific mechanisms, we need to understand the foundational philosophy that makes all of them possible, because without this philosophy, none of the strategies we're about to discuss would work. Old money thinks in generations, not quarters, not years, generations. This sounds simple. It is actually one of the most radical and counterintuitive ways of moving through the world that exists. We live in a culture that optimizes for the immediate. Quarterly earnings reports, annual bonuses, social media metrics measured in hours. Even long-term personal planning rarely extends beyond a 10 or 20-year horizon. Most financial advisors work within a single human lifetime. Old money families operate on an entirely different time axis. The Rothschild family bank, founded by Mayer Amschel Rothschild in Frankfurt in the 1760s, is still operating today, more than 250 years later. When Mayer Amschel was building his empire, he was not thinking about his own retirement. He was architecting a structure designed to function across multiple human lifetimes, through wars, revolutions, financial crises, and the complete restructuring of the global economy. He sent each of his 5 sons to a different European financial center: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, Frankfurt, specifically to build a network that no single political upheaval could destroy. If Napoleon conquered one country, the family had assets in 4 others. If one nation defaulted, the other nodes of the network remained solvent. That is generational thinking. It is strategic. It is almost militarily precise in its planning. The sociologist Randall Collins, writing about the dynamics of power maintenance, identified what he called interaction ritual chains. The idea that power is not a static possession, but a dynamic that must be continuously renewed through rituals, relationships, and institutional participation. Old money families, whether they've read Collins or not, understand this intuitively. Every dinner party, every board seat, every school enrollment, every charitable board position is part of a continuous renewal of the chain of power. This mindset also shapes how old money relates to risk. New money, having been earned, tends to be protected anxiously, hoarded, or alternatively spent conspicuously to signal its presence. Old money, paradoxically, is often more comfortable with calculated risk precisely because the time horizon is so long. A bad decade, even a bad generation, is survivable if the structure is sound. The Rothschilds lost enormous sums during the Napoleonic Wars. They recovered because the structure was more important than any single investment. Understanding this philosophy is essential to understanding every mechanism that follows. Because every mechanism we're about to describe is not a short-term tactic. It is a long-term structural investment in the perpetuation of family power. Legal architecture, the invisible walls around wealth. Now let's get specific. The first, and arguably most powerful mechanism, old money uses to protect family power is legal architecture, and it is breathtaking in its sophistication. The dynasty trust, the most powerful tool in the old money legal arsenal, is the dynasty trust, and most people have never heard of it. A standard trust transfers assets to beneficiaries and eventually dissolves. A dynasty trust is designed to last indefinitely. In some U.S. states, forever. Assets placed in a dynasty trust are owned by the trust, not by any individual family member. This single distinction has enormous consequences. Because the assets are not individually owned, they are protected from several threats that typically erode wealth. Divorce settlements cannot reach them. Creditors of individual family members cannot seize them. And, critically, they avoid estate taxes at each generational transfer. In the United States, the federal estate tax is currently 40% on estates above the exemption threshold. Without legal structures, a family fortune passes through this 40% tax at every generational transfer. 3 generations. The government has taken 40% 3 times. A dynasty trust sidesteps this almost entirely. Assets transfer within the trust without triggering the estate tax at each generation. South Dakota, Nevada, and Delaware have become the favored domiciles for American dynasty trusts because their laws are the most permissive. No rule against perpetuities, meaning trusts can last forever, strong asset protection from creditors, and rigorous privacy laws that make the trust contents essentially invisible to outsiders. The wealth management firm Fiduciary Trust International estimated that assets held in dynasty trusts in South Dakota alone exceeded $360 billion by 2021. That number has grown substantially since. The Family Limited Partnership. Another favored structure is the Family Limited Partnership, or FLP. In an FLP, the family's assets, real estate, investment portfolios, business interests, are pooled into a single partnership entity. Senior family members, typically the founders or their direct heirs, hold general partner interests and maintain control. Younger generations hold limited partner interests. They have economic participation, but no management authority. This structure accomplishes several things simultaneously. It centralizes decision-making in experienced hands while distributing economic benefit across the family. It allows assets to be transferred to younger generations at a discounted valuation. Because a minority limited partner interest in a private entity is worth less than a direct ownership stake of equivalent assets, courts have consistently allowed these interests to be valued at a 20% to 40% discount for gift and estate tax purposes. The family transfers more wealth at lower tax cost while retaining control. The Charitable Foundation, The Family Charitable Foundation is the most publicly visible piece of the old money legal architecture, and it is widely misunderstood. Foundations are typically framed and genuinely experienced by their creators as philanthropic instruments, and they do real philanthropic work, but they are also extraordinary power structures. Consider, a family foundation is exempt from income tax. It can hold and invest assets indefinitely, paying out a minimum of 5% annually to qualifying charitable purposes. The founding family typically controls the board, meaning they control which institutions receive grants, which causes are elevated, and which are not. This grant-making authority is itself a form of power. The institutions that receive foundation funding, universities, museums, hospitals, policy think tanks, arts organizations, develop relationships of dependency and deference to their funders. When a foundation that has given $50 million to a university over 20 years has an opinion about university policy or wants a seat on the board, that opinion carries extraordinary weight. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the Pew Charitable Trusts, these are not just philanthropies. They are power centers that shape academic research, public policy, cultural priorities, and political discourse. And they do so under the direction of families who have long since moved their personal finances out of the public spotlight. Tax attorney and wealth researcher Ray Madoff at Boston College Law School has written extensively about how the charitable foundation system in America serves as a mechanism for perpetuating the policy preferences and social priorities of wealthy families across generations, all while receiving substantial tax benefits funded by the public. This is not a conspiracy. It is a feature of the system, operating exactly as designed. But understanding it changes how you see the institutions that shape modern life. The oldest merger in history. Here's a question that sounds almost medieval. In 2025, do wealthy families still strategically manage who their children marry? The answer, documented by sociologists and confirmed by the behavior of virtually every major old money family across history, is yes. Not in the explicit arranged marriage sense, though that persists in some cultures, but in a structural sense that is just as effective and far less visible. Homophily, why birds of a feather? Really do flock together. Sociologists use the term homophily to describe the well-documented tendency of people to associate with others who are similar to themselves in education, income, class background, and values. In the general population, this tendency produces mild social clustering. In old money families, it is deliberately engineered and institutionally reinforced. Think about the mechanism. If you send your child to a private nursery school, then a prestigious boarding school, then an Ivy League university, then perhaps to a graduate program at Oxford or Sciences Po in Paris. And if at every stage their social world consists almost entirely of other children from similar backgrounds, the probability that they will form deep romantic attachments within that same social stratum is extremely high. Not because anyone explicitly dictated it, because the architecture of their social world made it statistically near inevitable. The debutante ball, widely dismissed as an anachronistic ritual, is, in its modern form, precisely a structured opportunity for the children of established families to meet each other in a supervised, vetted setting. The most prestigious American examples, the Infirmary Ball in New York, the Bal des Débutantes in Paris, the Queen Charlotte's Ball in London, are not primarily about the young women being presented. They are about the families in attendance being seen together and about the social network of the next generation being seeded. The prenuptial agreement as power architecture. When old money marriages do cross class boundaries, as they occasionally do, particularly when new money is acquired through genuine innovation, the prenuptial agreement becomes an instrument of family power preservation. A well-drafted prenuptial agreement, backed by sophisticated legal counsel, protects family trust assets, inherited property, and family business interests from division in divorce. Given that approximately 40 to 50% of marriages end in divorce, this is not paranoia. It is actuarial prudence. But the prenuptial agreement also serves a signaling function within the family. The requirement that an entering spouse sign a prenuptial agreement communicates clearly and formally that the family's assets are collective property with a history longer than the marriage, and that the family's interests take precedence over the individual union. This is not romantic. It is a structural statement about the relationship between the individual and the dynasty. The strategic alliance marriage. Beyond defensive marriage strategy, old money has historically used marriage as an offensive alliance-building tool. The Rothschild family's marriage strategy in the 19th century was so systematic it has been studied as a case in management science. Over several generations, Rothschild siblings and cousins married each other or married into other banking dynasties, creating financial alliances through family bonds that were more durable than any contract. When two banking families share grandchildren, their institutional interests become structurally aligned. This practice continues in modern form. When the children of two major private equity families meet at Princeton and marry, the resulting family unit consolidates not just personal affection, but investment networks, board relationships, and political connections accumulated across two separate generational histories. The merger of two social capital portfolios is not incidental to the marriage. It is one of its most consequential outcomes. Institutional capture: how old money controls the rooms where decisions are made. Let's talk about something that almost never gets discussed directly, even though its effects are visible everywhere: the systematic placement of old money representatives on the boards, committees, and governing bodies of the institutions that shape society. I want to be clear about what I mean by institutional capture. I don't mean corruption. I don't mean bribery. I mean something far more subtle and, in many ways, more durable. The accumulation of governing positions across a network of key institutions, such that the people who make consequential decisions about universities, hospitals, cultural institutions, regulatory bodies, and policy organizations are, disproportionately, drawn from a small and interconnected social class. University boards. Let's start with universities, because they are where the next generation of elites is produced and credentialed. The boards of trustees of America's most prestigious universities are populated overwhelmingly by wealthy donors and alumni from established families. A 2019 analysis by the Action on Access Research Group found that, at the 10 most prestigious American universities, more than 70% of board members came from backgrounds in finance, law, or business leadership, sectors in which old money is disproportionately represented. Board membership is consequential. Trustees set institutional priorities, approve presidential appointments, oversee endowment management, and make decisions about admissions policy, including the legacy admissions preferences that dramatically increase admission rates for children of alumni donors. A 2019 study published in the journal Economics of Education Review by economists Peter Arcidiacono, Josh Kinsler, and Tyler Ransom, found that legacy applicants to Harvard had a 45.1% admissions rate compared to 9.0% for non-legacy applicants with comparable academic profiles. Legacy preferences, in other words, nearly quintupled an applicant's chances of admission. And they operate, as the study noted, almost exclusively in favor of applicants from wealthy backgrounds, since poor and first-generation college families are dramatically underrepresented among alumni. The people who set the admissions policies that include these preferences? The boards of trustees, the same boards dominated by wealthy alumni. The circularity is not accidental. The Federal Reserve and financial regulation, the relationship between old money families and the American financial regulatory apparatus, has been one of the most studied and most contested topics in American political economy. The Federal Reserve's 12 regional banks are governed by boards of directors that include private sector representatives, predominantly drawn from the banking and finance industries. A 2011 audit by the Government Accountability Office found that the Federal Reserve's emergency lending programs during the 2008 financial crisis had provided $16 trillion in low-cost loans to financial institutions, many of whose executives were simultaneously serving on Federal Reserve boards. The revolving door between major financial institutions and their regulatory bodies is extensively documented. Treasury Secretaries Robert Rubin, Henry Paulson, and Stephen Mnuchin all came directly from senior positions at Goldman Sachs. The people who write the rules governing financial markets have, with remarkable consistency, come from the class of people those rules govern. Cultural institutions. Perhaps the most underappreciated form of institutional influence operated by old money is control of cultural institutions, museums, opera houses, symphony orchestras, arts foundations. This influence operates on multiple levels. At the most obvious level, large donations to cultural institutions purchase naming rights, board seats, and curatorial influence. The galleries of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the wings of the Museum of Modern Art, the concert halls of Lincoln Center. These spaces carry the names of the families who funded them, and those families retain ongoing influence over institutional direction. But the deeper influence is in what gets elevated as culture. The tastes, aesthetic preferences, and cultural priorities of the donor class shape which artists receive institutional support, which histories are told, which buildings are preserved, and which cultural narratives are amplified. Over generations, this shapes the broader cultural environment in which everyone lives, including the definition of what counts as educated or cultured. Pierre Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital, the idea that familiarity with elite culture functions as a form of currency in elite social spaces, gains its power precisely from this mechanism. The culture that wealthy families have spent generations elevating and institutionalizing becomes the culture that educational institutions teach, that job interviews signal competence through, and that social gatekeepers use to distinguish insiders from outsiders. Information asymmetry, the knowledge moat. Here is one of the least discussed but most powerful mechanisms of old money power protection: information asymmetry. The systematic access to information, relationships, and opportunities that is structurally unavailable to people outside the network. The family office. The family office is the command center of old money wealth management, and it is almost entirely invisible to the public. A family office is a private company established to manage the financial, legal, administrative, and lifestyle affairs of a single ultra-wealthy family. Unlike wealth management services available to merely affluent clients, a family office employs full-time specialists, investment professionals managing a diversified portfolio, tax attorneys optimizing the family's tax position across multiple jurisdictions, estate planners maintaining and updating the trust structures we discussed earlier, risk managers overseeing insurance and liability, and often concierge staff handling travel, real estate, and household management. According to a 2023 report by consulting firm Campton Wealth, there are approximately 10,000 single-family offices globally, managing a combined $6 trillion in assets. The average family office requires a minimum of $100 million in assets to be economically viable, meaning this infrastructure is available only at the very top of the wealth distribution. The investment access that family offices provide is categorically different from what retail investors or even high net worth individuals can access. Family offices routinely invest in private equity funds with minimum commitments of $10 million to $25 million, funds that have historically outperformed public markets over long time horizons. They invest in hedge fund strategies unavailable to retail investors. They co-invest directly in private companies, alongside private equity sponsors, often at favorable terms unavailable to outside investors. But beyond investment returns, the family office is an information gathering machine. The professional networks maintained by a family office's investment team, relationships with private equity GPS, investment bankers, venture capitalists, and corporate executives, generate a continuous flow of information about private deals, emerging opportunities, and market intelligence that people outside this network simply do not have access to. The deal flow network. In private markets, private equity, venture capital, private credit, real estate, the most attractive investment opportunities are almost never publicly advertised. They flow through networks, relationships, introductions. When a private equity firm is raising a new fund, it approaches its existing investors first, the institutions and family offices that participated in previous funds. When a technology founder is raising a Series A round, they approach investors who were introduced by trusted mutual connections. When a real estate developer has an off-market property to sell, they call their network before it ever hits a listing. Old money families, through generations of investment activity, have accumulated positions in these networks that are functionally irreplaceable without either enormous wealth or extraordinary access. Their deal flow is self-perpetuating. Past investment relationships generate new investment introductions, which generate new returns, which generate new relationships. This creates what economists call a Matthew effect, named for the biblical verse, "To him who has, more will be given." The information networks available to old money families compound over time just as financial assets do. And unlike financial assets, they cannot be simply purchased by someone newly wealthy. They must be earned through years of participation in the network. Political access as information, perhaps the most consequential form of information asymmetry, operated by old money, is political access, the ongoing relationship with legislators, regulators, and policymakers that provides advance information about regulatory changes, tax law modifications, and policy directions before they become public. This is not necessarily corruption. Much of it is entirely legal. It operates through campaign donations, which purchase access to elected officials. Through lobbying, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry staffed almost entirely by former government officials, another revolving door. Through policy councils and advisory boards on which wealthy individuals participate and through which they receive and provide information about policy direction. The practical consequence is significant. When a major tax law change is being considered in Congress, the families with the deepest Washington connections have attorneys reviewing draft legislation months before it is finalized. They can structure transactions, reposition assets, and adjust their legal architecture in anticipation of changes that other wealth holders only learn about when the law is passed. The information advantage translates directly into financial advantage. Narrative control, managing the story of the dynasty. Power without legitimacy is fragile. One of the most sophisticated things old money families do, and one of the least discussed, is the active management of their own narrative. How they are perceived, what story is told about them, how their wealth is framed in public discourse. Philanthropy as reputation architecture. We touched on charitable foundations earlier as legal and financial instruments. Now let's look at them as reputation management tools, because this is equally, if not more, important. The transformation of the Rockefeller family's public image is the most dramatic example in American history. By the 1890s and early 1900s, John D. Rockefeller was one of the most despised men in America. Ida Tarbell's landmark investigative series in McClure's magazine between 1902 and 1904 exposed Standard Oil's monopolistic practices in devastating detail. Congress moved to break up the Standard Oil monopoly. The Rockefeller name was synonymous, in the public mind, with predatory capitalism. What happened next is a masterclass in narrative rehabilitation. On the advice of early public relations pioneer Ivy Lee, widely considered one of the founders of the modern PR industry, Rockefeller began a systematic program of highly visible philanthropy and carefully managed public appearances. He distributed dimes to children on the street, literally. He carried them in his pocket. He funded the University of Chicago. He established the Rockefeller Foundation. He was photographed attending church. Within 2 decades, the narrative had shifted from robber baron to philanthropist. The same wealth that had been condemned as ill-gotten became, through the alchemy of strategic giving, the foundation of cultural and educational institutions that enhanced American life. This pattern has been replicated by virtually every subsequent generation of wealthy families facing public scrutiny. Andrew Carnegie's libraries, the Ford Foundation's civil rights funding, the Gates Foundation's global health work. Each represents genuine philanthropic impact and simultaneously a sophisticated management of public narrative about the source of the family's wealth and power. Controlling the historical record, less visibly, but just as importantly, old money families invest in controlling their own historical record. Founding historians at universities, endowing archives and libraries that bear the family name, commissioning authorized biographies, donating family papers to university archives, where they are preserved and studied, but also where the family retains some influence over access and framing. The DuPont family of Delaware, one of America's oldest and most powerful industrial dynasties, has been extraordinarily effective at this. The Hagley Museum and Library, established on the site of the original DuPont gunpowder mills in Wilmington, Delaware, curates and presents the family's history in a context that emphasizes innovation, industrial development, and American progress, framing that is both accurate and strategically incomplete. The media relationship. Old money families have historically maintained complex and carefully managed relationships with media institutions, both through ownership and through social proximity. The intermarriage between newspaper-owning families and political and financial families in the 20th century was extensive. The social proximity of major journalists and editors to the elite families they covered, attending the same clubs, sending children to the same schools, socializing in the same summer communities, created structural incentives for deferential coverage that have been extensively documented by media critics, including Ben Bagdikian, in The Media Monopoly. In the contemporary landscape, this relationship has evolved. Direct media ownership remains a tool of narrative control. Rupert Murdoch's Fox News and News Corp empire being the most obvious example of a wealthy family using media ownership to shape political discourse in alignment with its interests. But more subtly, the concentration of media ownership in the hands of a small number of private equity-backed conglomerates whose owners overlap significantly with the old money investment network creates structural pressures on editorial independence that operate without any explicit editorial direction. The next generation, how power is transferred and taught all of the structures we've discussed, the trusts, the foundations, the board seats, the marriage networks, the information advantages, are only as durable as the next generation's ability and willingness to maintain them. This is where old money families invest perhaps their most profound and least visible energy, in the transmission of power across generations. The family constitution. Many sophisticated old money families maintain what is called a family constitution or family charter, a formal document that articulates the family's values, governance structure, decision-making processes, and expectations of family members. A family constitution might specify how decisions about the family trust are made, who sits on the family council, what qualifications are required for family members to receive distributions, what standards of behavior are expected of family members in public and private, and how disputes within the family are resolved. The existence of such a document communicates to each generation that the family is not simply a collection of individuals who happen to share blood and money. It is an institution with governance, accountability, and continuity that transcends any individual member. James Hughes, a leading American authority on family wealth governance, and the author of Family Wealth. Keeping it in the family argues that the families most successful at multi-generational wealth preservation are those that treat the family itself as the primary asset to be managed, not the financial assets. The human capital, education, skills, judgment, social capital, relationships, reputation, and values, capital, shared mission, and identity of the family are, in this framework, at least as important as the financial capital. The summer compound. This may seem like an odd section heading, but bear with me, because the summer compound, or its international equivalents, is one of the most effective transmission mechanisms old money has ever developed. When a family gathers year after year at the same property, the same main island, the same Nantucket house, the same Tuscany villa, the same Scottish estate, something subtle and powerful happens over decades. The next generation absorbs, through lived experience rather than explicit instruction, the norms, values, relationships, and social behaviors of the class. They meet, naturally and repeatedly, the other families in the summer community. They develop friendships and eventually romantic relationships within that network. They observe how their parents and grandparents navigate wealth, with what mixture of enjoyment, and responsibility? With what attitudes towards staff and tradespeople? With what relationship to the institutions and communities that surround the property? The ethnographer Sherry Ortner, in her research on American class culture, observed that the summer community functions as what she called a total institution of class reproduction, a contained social environment in which the entirety of elite social norms and behaviors is transmitted experientially without anyone having to explicitly teach it. It is absorbed over childhood the way a native language is absorbed, deeply, fluently, and without conscious effort. Structured introduction to family institutions. Beyond the informal transmission of values, sophisticated old money families provide structured, intentional introductions to family institutions and responsibilities. This typically begins in adolescence. A teenager in the family might be invited to sit in on a family council meeting, not as a voting participant, but as an observer. They learn how decisions are made. They hear the language of wealth management, governance, and family strategy. They absorb the implicit values underlying the decisions. By their mid-20s, they may be given a small portfolio to manage independently, with family office support, as a form of apprenticeship in investment judgment. They receive their own relationships with the family's lawyers, accountants, and bankers. They are introduced through family social networks to the people in finance, law, and business who will be their professional contacts for life. By their 30s, they are expected to take active roles, joining foundation boards, attending investment committee meetings, beginning to build their own institutional relationships. The transition from beneficiary of family power to steward of it is carefully managed and incrementally staged. This process is strikingly different from what happens in families where wealth is simply handed to the next generation, without context, governance, or preparation, which is, as the Williams and Pricer research we mentioned in our last video showed, the primary reason that 70% of family wealth is dissipated by the second generation and 90% by the third. When it fails, the cautionary cases. In the interest of balance, and because the failures are as instructive as the successes, let's look at what happens when these mechanisms break down. Because they do break down. Old money is not invincible, and the patterns of failure are remarkably consistent. The Vanderbilt collapse. We touched on the Vanderbilts in our last video, but the full story deserves more attention here. Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877 with a fortune of $100 million, the largest in American history at that point. He left the overwhelming majority to his son William Henry, who promptly doubled it. So far, so good. What Cornelius and William Henry did not do was build the legal architecture, governance structures, and family institution framework we've been discussing. There was no dynasty trust, no family constitution, no formal governance, and critically, there was no cultural transmission of a stewardship mentality to the next generation. Instead, the Vanderbilt grandchildren and great-grandchildren experienced the wealth as an entitlement to be enjoyed, not a responsibility to be stewarded. The result was an extraordinary competition in consumption. The various branches of the family built competing mansions on Fifth Avenue, competing cottages in Newport, the Breakers, Marble House, Belcourt Castle, each more extravagant than the last, and competing ocean-going yachts. Each branch was essentially trying to outdisplay the others, while the underlying fortune eroded. By the 1970s, As Vanderbilt biographer Arthur T. Vanderbilt II documented, the family held its first ever family reunion, and there was not a single millionaire among the 120 descendants in attendance. A fortune that had been the largest in American history, gone in less than a century. The Rothschild contrast. The Rothschild family provides an instructive contrast. Facing similar forces, multiple generations, enormous initial wealth, dispersal across many heirs, the Rothschild family preserved its wealth and influence across 2.5 centuries by doing almost everything the Vanderbilts did not. They maintained tight family governance. The early Rothschild partnerships required family consensus on major decisions. They practiced strategic marriage alliances that kept capital within the network. They diversified geographically before diversification was a recognized investment concept. And they maintained a culture of stewardship rather than consumption. Rothschild family members were expected to be active participants in managing the family's affairs, not passive recipients of its wealth. The difference in outcome is stark. The Rothschild family remains active in global finance and maintains substantial wealth and influence today. The Vanderbilts' most famous legacy is a museum. The legal architecture failure, the Duke tobacco fortune, James Buchanan. Duke built the American Tobacco Company into one of the most valuable corporations in America in the late 19th and early 20th century. His estate planning, however, was inadequate for the multi-generational challenge. His daughter, Doris Duke, inherited an enormous fortune, but found it substantially unprotected from the various legal and personal challenges that attended great wealth: lawsuits, predatory romantic partners, governance disputes. The Doris Duke story, ending with a contested will, accusations against a trusted advisor, and years of legal dispute over the estate, is a case study in what happens when financial wealth is not paired with adequate legal architecture, governance structures, and the social capital to navigate complex situations. What this means for the rest of us, and what we can learn now. A question I want to address directly, because I think it's the most important one this video raises. Is this system fair? The honest answer is not entirely. The mechanisms we've described, the dynasty trusts that avoid taxes, the legacy admissions preferences, the information networks unavailable to outsiders, the institutional capture that shapes policy in favor of established wealth. These are not a level playing field. Economists Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zucman, in their landmark research on wealth inequality, have documented that the concentration of wealth in the United States has returned to levels not seen since the 1920s. The top 0.1% of American households owns approximately 20% of all household wealth. The structural mechanisms we've discussed are significant contributors to this concentration. Reform efforts, stronger estate taxes, elimination of legacy admissions, increased foundation payout requirements, greater transparency in trust structures, are actively debated, and that debate is important and legitimate. But here's what I also want to say. Many of the principles underlying these mechanisms are not exclusive to old money. They are applicable in scaled and adapted forms to families at every wealth level, and understanding them is the first step to applying them. The Dynasty Trust requires $10 million minimum to be practical in its full form. But the underlying principle, protect assets from unnecessary taxation, structure ownership to prevent erosion through divorce or litigation, can be applied by anyone with meaningful assets through a revocable living trust, a properly structured LLC for investment property, and adequate insurance. The family constitution is written by $50 million families with teams of lawyers. But the underlying practice, having explicit conversations with your family about values, financial expectations, and the responsibilities that come with inherited assets, is free and transformatively powerful. The generational time horizon of old money investment, patient capital, compounding over decades, prioritizing wealth preservation over short-term returns, is available to anyone with a brokerage account and the discipline to leave it alone for 30 years. The information networks of old money are not accessible from outside. But the principle, invest in relationships, be genuinely useful to your network. Think of social capital as a real and cultivable asset, is one anyone can act on. None of this erases the structural advantages of birth, but it changes the question from, why don't I have what they have, to, what can I build with the principles I've just learned? Old money power is not magic. It is not luck. It is not simply the accumulation of financial returns. It is a system, a carefully constructed, continuously maintained, multi-generationally refined system of legal architecture, social network management, institutional influence, information access, narrative control, and intentional transmission of values and strategy to the next generation. The families that have held power for 2, 3, 4 generations did not do so by accident. They did it by building institutions, legal, social, cultural, that were more durable than any individual, more resilient than any market cycle, and more powerful than any single investment. The question is not whether you admire this system or whether you think it's just. The question is whether you understand it, because you cannot navigate a world shaped by these forces without understanding how they work. You cannot protect your own family's interests without knowing what the most sophisticated families in the world do to protect theirs, and you cannot participate meaningfully in the public debate about wealth inequality without understanding the actual mechanisms that produce it. Now you do. Drop a comment. Which mechanism surprised you most? The dynasty trust? The marriage strategy? The institutional capture? Tell me below. I read everything. If this changed how you see inherited wealth, hit like. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who deserve to understand how this world works. Subscribe and hit the bell. Share this with one person in your life who thinks wealth inequality is simply about hard work. Not to argue, just to inform. I will see you in the next.